The last thing Evan Carter expected after a flawless morning of tennis was to find 3 6-year-old boys drawing dinosaurs and smiley faces all over his luxury car. But what truly stopped him cold wasn't the chalk, it was their faces. Identical. Familiar. And the woman sitting nearby, quietly reading, who looked like a ghost from the life he thought he'd left behind. Evan Carter never missed a tennis morning. It was his one untouchable ritual, tucked neatly between high-stakes meetings and business calls. He liked the control it gave him, the predictability of the game, the silence of early courts and the sound of a clean serve. That morning was no different, until it was. After a quick warm-up and a few sets with his trainer, Evan walked back toward the parking lot, towel draped over his shoulder, expecting nothing more than a quiet ride to his office and the usual onslaught of emails. But the moment he turned the corner, he stopped in his tracks. 3 small boys, around 6 years old, were crouched in front of his matte black Porsche. All of them had chalk in their hands, one red, one blue, one green, and they were drawing. Not on the pavement, not near the tires, but directly on the car. The hood now had a wonky sun, the driver's side door was home to a shaky but detailed dinosaur, and the windshield had a big, "Hi" scrawled across it in rainbow letters. They didn't notice him right away. They were focused, completely absorbed in their masterpiece. Evan felt something between disbelief and outrage rise in his chest. This was a custom-painted, limited-edition sports car. The kind of car people didn't even lean on, let alone treat like a sidewalk canvas. He took a step forward, his jaw already tightening, but then one of the boys turned. The child had soft, reddish-brown curls and wide brown eyes that blinked up at him without fear. A second later, the other 2 turned too, triplets, unmistakably. Identical expressions, identical eyes, identical curls, though each had his own energy. One looked startled, the second defiant, the third grinned without hesitation. It threw Evan off balance. They were adorable, yes, but more than that, they were eerily familiar. There was something about the shape of their eyes, the way one of them furrowed his brow, the way another tilted his head with quiet defiance, it struck Evan like a distant echo of something he couldn't place. He cleared his throat, not entirely sure what to say. "Where are your parents?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. One of the boys pointed casually toward a bench shaded by a large tree. "Our mom's reading," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Evan followed the direction of the boy's finger. There, sitting alone, was a woman with a book resting in her lap, her head tilted slightly as she turned the page. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands curling along her cheekbones, and she wore a long cardigan over jeans and sneakers. She looked completely at peace, completely unaware, or perhaps completely unbothered, by what her sons were doing. Evan narrowed his eyes, something catching in his chest. There was something about her posture, the way she moved her hand as she turned the page, the way her face looked calm but just slightly tired. He started walking toward her, still holding the towel in his hand, footsteps heavier than before. The closer he got, the louder his heart began to pound, not out of anger, but confusion. Because when she finally looked up from the book and met his eyes, everything around him stopped. It was Claire. Claire Donovan. He hadn't seen her in over 6 years. Not since their abrupt ending. Not since she disappeared from his life without a real goodbye. And now, here she was. Sitting on a bench. Watching 3 children who looked like someone he might have been. The towel slipped slightly from his shoulder, but he didn't move to catch it. Claire blinked as if she wasn't sure she was seeing him right. "Evan," she said, her voice quiet but unmistakable. And in that moment, the only thought in his mind was one he wasn't ready to admit out loud: those boys weren't just familiar. They looked like him. Claire stood slowly from the bench, her book forgotten on the seat beside her, hands clenched at her sides as she looked at Evan like she was seeing a ghost. Her expression flickered between shock, guilt, and something else, something closer to quiet dread. Evan didn't speak right away. Neither did she. The air between them was heavy with unfinished history, words never spoken, and time that had passed too loudly to be ignored. The boys, unaware of the storm gathering between the adults, continued their playful banter behind him, now giggling as they drew mustaches on the car's headlights. Evan took a breath, grounding himself. He hadn't expected to see Claire again. He hadn't thought about her for a long time, or at least that's what he'd convinced himself. But the moment her eyes met his, all of it came back. The way she used to laugh into his chest. The way she would fall asleep mid-sentence, curled into him like the world couldn't touch her there. And the way she had left. No call. No message. Just silence. He had buried that hurt under years of building walls and climbing ladders. And now she was standing in front of him like no time had passed. Except it had. And clearly, it hadn't passed alone. He glanced back at the boys again, taking them in with new clarity. All three of them had his eyes. His cheekbones. The middle one even had his crooked grin. Evan turned to Claire fully, voice quieter than he intended. Are they mine? Claire didn't answer immediately. She looked down, one hand tightening around her wrist, and then back up. Can we talk? She asked, nodding toward a path that led away from the courts. Evan didn't respond, but his feet moved. They walked in silence for a few moments until the sounds of the boys faded behind them. They reached a quieter corner of the park where the trees stretched wide overhead and the sun filtered gently through the branches. Claire stopped and finally looked at him, really looked. No, she said softly. They're not yours. Evan blinked, momentarily stunned by the simplicity of the answer. He opened his mouth to speak, but she continued. I found out I was pregnant about 2 weeks after you left for London. I tried to call. I emailed. But you had changed numbers. Your assistant screened everything. I thought maybe it wasn't meant to be. I told myself it was better for everyone if I didn't push. I didn't want to beg you to come back. And I didn't want to raise them with resentment between us. So you didn't even try to tell me again? Evan asked, his voice sharp but not loud. Claire, I would've. Would you? She cut in, not unkindly. Would you have left your job, your company, your plans, to come back for someone who was pregnant with triplets? The question hung between them. Not as an accusation, but as a real, raw uncertainty. Evan didn't answer right away. Because he wasn't sure what the truth was. Maybe back then, the version of him that boarded a plane to London would have run. Maybe that Evan wouldn't have known how to handle 3 lives growing inside someone he hadn't planned on building a future with. But they're not mine, he said, more to confirm it to himself than anything. They're not yours, Claire repeated. Their father left before they were even born. He said he wasn't built for this. I believed him. And honestly, I'm glad he's gone. It made me stronger. It made me their only constant. Evan looked at her, not with pity, but with something like awe. Raising one child alone was difficult. 3. It was nearly impossible. And yet she had done it. Without complaint. Without help. Without him. Why are you here? She asked suddenly. Why now? He looked at her, then back in the direction of the boys, and then returned his gaze to her face. I wasn't looking for you, he admitted. I didn't even know you were in the same city. I was just playing tennis. And then I saw them. Saw you. And something stopped me. Claire exhaled slowly. Well, here we are. Evan nodded. Yeah. Here we are. Neither of them knew what the next step was. But they both knew the moment had shifted something permanent. The past wasn't gone. The answers weren't simple. But the connection that once tied them together hadn't vanished. It had only gone quiet. And now, it was beginning to speak again. Later that evening, Evan sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by glass walls and breathtaking views that felt more distant than ever before. The city sparkled beneath him, but it didn't touch him. Nothing did. The silence in the room was heavy, not peaceful like it used to be, but suffocating. His mind wouldn't stop replaying the day. The chalk drawings. The identical boys. Claire's voice. The weight of her choices. And his own. He had come home not knowing what to feel. He wasn't angry, not exactly. But he was unsettled in a way he hadn't been in years. He poured himself a drink, something he rarely did outside of business dinners, and stood by the window, staring out into the city he'd conquered. It felt ridiculous now, how much effort he had put into this image of control and precision. What good had it done him? He had money, power, real estate in 4 countries, and not a single moment in that entire day had meant more than the one where a 6-year-old had grinned at him with a chalk-stained hand and eyes that looked too much like his own. He hadn't expected them to be his. But part of him, some small, unspoken part, had wanted them to be. And when Claire said they weren't, something inside him cracked open. Not from relief. From loss. He sat down at the edge of his leather sofa, elbows on his knees, the glass still in his hand. He hadn't seen Claire in 6 years, but she'd haunted parts of him in ways he'd refused to admit. He remembered her laughter, her stubborn optimism, the way she challenged his cold logic without ever yelling. She was the only woman he had ever let close enough to leave a mark. And he had convinced himself she'd simply vanished, that she'd chosen to disappear. But now, seeing her again, seeing what she had built, who she had become, it was like time folded in on itself. And then there were the boys. He couldn't stop thinking about them. The way they stood close together like a unit, the way they finished each other's sentences, how they were clearly mischievous and curious and full of energy. They weren't his, but it didn't matter. They existed. They were part of her. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he wanted to know them. Not as an obligation. Not to fix anything. Just to be near them. Evan had never been someone who longed for a family. His childhood had been a map of distance, boarding schools, nannies, empty houses with long dinner tables. His father had taught him how to lead but never how to care. His mother had loved him, he supposed, but from a far-off place, always preoccupied, always a bit distracted. He had promised himself a different life. A better one. But he had filled it with things instead of people. And now, for the first time, he felt the emptiness of that decision. He reached for his phone but stopped himself before calling Claire. What would he say? He didn't have answers. He wasn't ready to ask for anything. He wasn't even sure what he wanted from her, or from the children. All he knew was that he couldn't go back to pretending he didn't care. He set the glass down and stood up. His reflection in the window stared back at him, sharp suit, clean lines, the man everyone knew. But tonight he didn't feel like that man. He felt like someone standing at the edge of something he didn't understand. Something real. Something terrifying. He turned off the lights and went to bed without checking his email for the first time in years. And just before he drifted into sleep, he saw the faces of 3 boys with wild curls and chalk-covered hands. And he knew this wasn't over. 3 days passed before Evan saw Claire again. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't reached out. But every minute since that conversation in the park had pressed on him like weight he couldn't put down. He went through the motions of his daily life, meetings, calls, documents, all flawlessly executed, but nothing felt the same. His focus slipped during boardroom discussions. He forgot names. He stared too long at pictures of playground developments in one of his company's urban renewal proposals. Every child's face reminded him of the 3 boys who weren't his, but somehow already lived inside his thoughts. He didn't fully understand why. He just knew that something had cracked open inside him, and now it refused to close. That Friday, his car turned toward the park on instinct more than intent. He had no idea if they'd be there. It was late afternoon, the golden hour where the sun draped itself across the city like honey. The playground came into view, and there they were, just like before. The boys were climbing the jungle gym, yelling to each other with the wild energy only 6-year-olds possessed. And Claire was on the same bench, her posture more alert this time. She noticed him the moment he stepped out of the car, and though her body tensed, she didn't look away. He walked over slowly, without an agenda. He had nothing rehearsed. She stood before he even reached her, brushing her palms against her jeans like she needed to prepare herself for impact. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again," she said. "I wasn't sure I was coming." They looked at each other for a moment. Not like strangers, not like old lovers either. Like two people finally realizing they still knew the shapes of each other's silences. "I've been thinking," he started. "About them. About you. About what happened." Claire folded her arms, not defensively, but out of the need to hold something in place. "You don't owe us anything, Evan. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you?" He took a breath, long and deep, and for once in his life, he didn't try to edit the emotion out of his voice. "Because I don't want to walk away. I'm not asking for anything. I can't pretend it didn't happen. That I didn't see you. That I didn't see them." She softened slightly but still didn't fully let go. "They're good kids. You don't need to get involved just to ease some guilt or curiosity." "I'm not curious," he said. "I'm drawn." Claire looked down, visibly shaken by the honesty in his words. "They've never had anyone," she said after a pause. "Not really. It's just been me. And I've done my best. But I've always known something was missing." "I'm not trying to fill a gap," Evan said carefully. "I'm just trying to be present in a moment I didn't see coming. Maybe it means something. Maybe it doesn't. But it feels real." They sat in silence for a while, watching the boys play. One of them, the middle child, slipped off the edge of the slide and landed hard on his knees. He didn't cry, but he looked around quickly, eyes wide with that sudden need for comfort. Before Claire could move, Evan stood and jogged over, crouching beside the boy without hesitation. "Hey," he said gently. "You okay, champ?" The boy nodded, blinking fast. Evan brushed the dirt from his jeans and smiled. "Tough one, huh?" The boy gave a small, surprised grin. Evan offered a fist bump, which the boy returned like it was the most natural thing in the world. Claire watched from a distance, something in her chest tightening. When Evan returned, she looked at him differently. "You knew exactly what to do," she said. "I had no idea what I was doing. And that's exactly why it worked." They left the park together. Not as a couple, not with any decisions made, but with something unspoken taking root between them. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a beginning. It was an opening. A moment where maybe, just maybe, the past wasn't as closed as they thought. The days that followed were nothing like Evan had experienced before. He had lived a life of structure, of well-oiled calendars and appointments booked months in advance, where every moment was accounted for. But suddenly, his world became filled with spontaneity and noise, small, joyful chaos he didn't know he needed. He didn't make any formal declaration to Claire, didn't ask permission to enter their lives in any official way. He simply started showing up. Sometimes it was in the late afternoon at the park, other times it was with a bag of groceries when she looked too tired to cook. Once, he arrived with art supplies after hearing one of the boys say he wished they had better markers. He didn't try to impress them. He didn't ask for their attention. He just made himself present. And it was that presence, quiet and steady, that began to change everything. Claire didn't say much in those early days. She didn't ask him what he wanted. She didn't define boundaries. But she watched. Closely. She saw how he knelt down when the boys talked to him, how he remembered who liked what color, how he instinctively stepped between them and the street when they walked, even when she forgot to. There were moments when she caught herself smiling at him without realizing it, moments when she almost reached for his hand and then stopped herself. She wasn't ready for trust. But she was beginning to believe he meant what he had said. The boys, for their part, accepted Evan in the way only children can, purely and without question. They didn't know what he had done or failed to do in the past. They didn't care. He was there now, and that was enough. They asked him to read to them at night when he stayed late. They dragged him into their board game arguments and demanded he be the referee. They called him Evan at first, but then one of them, the youngest by 2 minutes, slipped and called him Dad during a game of tag. The word hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning neither of them dared acknowledge. Evan didn't correct him. He just smiled and kept playing, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. One evening, Evan stayed after dinner. The boys were upstairs, bathing, and the house was filled with the sound of running water and laughter echoing down the hallway. Claire was washing dishes, her back to him, and he offered to dry. They worked in silence at first, their movements in rhythm, the domesticity of it both strange and familiar. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't expect you to stay this long. I didn't expect to want to." Claire set down a glass and turned to look at him. "They're starting to get attached. So am I." Her lips parted slightly, the breath catching in her throat. "I don't want them to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt." "I'm not leaving," he said. "I don't know what this is yet, or what it's going to become. But I know I want to be in it." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to find the flaw in his sincerity. But she didn't find it. And for the first time since he returned to her life, she let herself believe this might not end the way everything else had. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep and the house had gone still, Claire walked Evan to the door. He turned before stepping out, as if waiting for her to say something, and she reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For showing up." Evan looked at her for a long moment, then leaned forward and kissed her forehead. It was simple. Gentle. A promise without words. And when he left, the silence he left behind no longer felt like absence. It felt like hope. A month passed, and Evan had become more than a visitor, more than a drop-in presence around dinner time or on weekend afternoons. Without announcing it or even fully realizing when it had happened, he had become woven into the rhythm of their lives. He knew which of the boys liked peanut butter and which one hated it. He knew who needed the night light on and who insisted on sleeping with the curtains wide open. He could tell which footsteps on the stairs belonged to which child and how to tell their laughter apart, even though their voices often overlapped. He had memorized the lyrics to songs he'd never imagined singing and had learned to navigate mornings full of mismatched socks, cereal spills, and last-minute backpack hunts like it was second nature. Claire watched him with a mix of disbelief and quiet admiration. He had not only shown up, but stayed, and more than that, he participated. He didn't just bring gifts or offer token attention. He changed diapers when needed, showed up at parent-teacher meetings, helped with school projects that involved far too much glitter. He sat through endless conversations about dinosaurs and space rockets and listened, really listened, when one of the boys had a bad day and didn't know how to explain it. She saw him grow into a role that neither of them had discussed out loud, but that he was stepping into with every day that passed. They still hadn't talked about labels. Not about what they were to each other now, or what they would be. There were no declarations, no late-night confessions of love. It was quieter than that, deeper somehow. She felt it when he brought her coffee before she even asked, when he stood next to her during bedtime stories and didn't rush off afterward. She felt it when their hands brushed and neither of them pulled away. The love wasn't loud, it was steady, and she had never trusted anything more. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the living room filled with that soft, golden light, Claire walked in to find Evan lying on the floor, 3 heads resting on his chest as he told them a story from memory. No book. No pictures. Just his voice and their trust. One of the boys had fallen asleep, arm draped across Evan's stomach, mouth slightly open. Another was barely keeping his eyes open. The third stared up at the ceiling, listening intently. Evan glanced up when he saw Claire and smiled, not moving, not wanting to break the spell. She stood there longer than she meant to, arms folded, heart aching with a kind of gratitude she didn't know how to express. Later, when the boys had been tucked into bed and the house was quiet again, she found Evan in the kitchen, rinsing out cups they had left behind. "You're good at this," she said softly. He didn't turn around, just nodded. "I didn't know I would be." "They adore you." "I adore them." She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "And what about me?" He finally turned, meeting her gaze with a kind of honesty that made her breath catch. "You scare me," he said. "Because you're the first thing in my life I didn't plan for that I never want to lose." Claire stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, until she was standing right in front of him. She rested her hand on his chest, over the place where his heart beat steady and strong. "Then don't leave." "I wasn't going to," he whispered. She kissed him then, not out of impulse, not because the moment demanded it, but because her whole body already knew he belonged. The kiss wasn't rushed or fiery. It was sure. Certain. Familiar in a way that only something deeply earned can feel. That night, they didn't talk about the future. They didn't need to. It was already unfolding between them in the smallest moments, in the quiet smiles, in the way they moved through the house together as if they'd always been one unit. And for the first time in years, Claire slept deeply, knowing that someone was still there when she opened her eyes. Evan had never thought of himself as someone who needed a family. He'd spent years building walls around his life, structuring everything with purpose, productivity, and precision. But now, as he sat at the small kitchen table in Claire's house, watching one of the boys make faces into his glass of orange juice while the others argued over which dinosaur would win in a fight, he felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pride or peace exactly, it was fuller than that. It was a quiet, aching joy. He didn't belong here because of obligation. He belonged here because something in his soul had shifted, cracked open, and let real life rush in. The days had blurred into something beautiful. Mornings were chaotic but warm. Evenings were filled with bedtime stories and the soft rhythm of shared routines. Claire had started leaving little notes on the fridge when she left early for work, reminders for the boys, but sometimes with a quick, "thank you," or a drawn heart for Evan. It was never dramatic, never too much, but enough to remind him that this was no longer temporary. He was here, and she saw him. He began to notice the smallest things about each boy. How Theo, the loudest and most imaginative, bit his nails when he was nervous. How Max, always pretending to be brave, would quietly seek out Evan's hand when the movie got scary. And Ben, the youngest by minutes, but the most introspective, liked to sit beside Evan without speaking, just to be close. It wasn't about big moments. It was about thousands of tiny ones. That's what built trust. That's what made them a family. One evening, after a long day at the park and a living room fort building competition that ended with pillow casualties and endless laughter, Claire pulled Evan aside. The boys were upstairs, supposedly getting ready for bed, which meant they were likely still half-dressed and negotiating toothbrush time. She looked serious but not tense, her fingers fidgeting slightly with the hem of her sweater. "There's something I want to talk to you about," she said, her voice careful. Evan straightened, immediately attentive. "Of course. What is it?" She took a breath. "They've been asking questions. Not about their biological father, not directly. But, they're trying to make sense of who you are. And I think it's time we give them some kind of answer." Evan nodded slowly. "What do you think they need?" "I think they need to know they can count on you. That you're not going to disappear one day. That you're not just a very nice guest who reads stories and plays soccer in the yard." He hesitated, not because he disagreed, but because the truth of it hit him harder than he expected. "I don't want them to wonder," he said. "And I don't want them to feel like they have to earn me being here. I'm here because I want to be." Claire met his eyes. "Then maybe it's time we make that official." The words hung in the air, not as a demand but as a possibility. Evan felt the weight of them settle into his chest, not as pressure, but as purpose. He thought about how much had changed, how much he had changed, and how much these boys already meant to him. And then he saw something in Claire's eyes, a flicker of hope mixed with fear, the fragile courage of a woman who had done it alone for so long and was still learning how to let someone in. "I want to adopt them," he said quietly. "If that's something you and they would want. I know I can't replace anyone. I don't want to. But I'd be proud to be their father." Claire didn't cry. She just exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. Then she reached out and touched his face, her thumb brushing the edge of his jaw like she was memorizing him all over again. "They would be lucky to have you," she said. "But so would I." Upstairs, the boys erupted into a fit of laughter that echoed through the house like music. Evan looked toward the ceiling, then back at Claire, his hand wrapping around hers. "Then let's do it," he whispered. "Let's give them that security. Let's give them all of us." And just like that, without ceremony or witnesses, the foundation of their future was set. Not on perfection, not on blood, but on love freely chosen. On presence. On staying. And for the first time in his life, Evan wasn't building something for the world to see. He was building something that would last even when no one else was looking. The morning of the adoption hearing was quiet, almost strangely so. The sky outside was soft with early light, and the usual rush of shoes slamming against floors and cereal spilling on counters was replaced with something gentler, more intentional. Claire had helped the boys into their little button-down shirts and combed through their wild curls, trying to keep them in some form of order, though the energy in them made it nearly impossible. Evan stood nearby, adjusting their tiny collars, kneeling down to tie Max's shoe, smiling softly as Theo declared he was going to "tell the judge we already like you so she says yes faster." There was nervousness in the air, yes, but there was also excitement. The kind that lives in children when they know something important is about to happen, even if they don't fully understand it. Claire watched Evan as he moved through the house with steady hands and a calm that hadn't always been there. He had grown into this role not with declarations or grand gestures, but with every small choice to stay, to listen, to love without needing to be asked. She could still remember the man who had once lived in glass towers and met the world through polished schedules and polite detachment. But this version of him, this man in front of her now, was softer without being weaker, stronger because he had chosen to lean in, not run. At the courthouse, everything moved slowly at first. Paperwork. Waiting. A small family courtroom with a warm judge who smiled kindly at the boys and asked them easy questions to help them feel comfortable. Claire sat beside Evan, her hand gripping his under the table, fingers interlaced tightly. The boys sat in chairs too big for them, their feet dangling, their legs swinging in time. When asked if they understood what was happening, they each nodded with eager certainty. And when the judge asked why they wanted Evan to be their dad, Theo answered quickly and without hesitation, because he already is. Claire's heart twisted, and Evan didn't hide the way his throat tightened as he reached to gently tousle Theo's hair. The judge smiled at that, then turned to Evan with a warmth that made the room feel less like a courtroom and more like a home being made in real time. She asked Evan why he wanted to take this step, and his voice, though quiet, held no uncertainty. "Because I love them. Because they are already mine in every way that matters. And I want them to know that I'm not going anywhere." The moment the judge signed the papers, it was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. A final flourish of pen to paper. A few official words. But what it meant, what it changed, was everything. Evan was their father now. Legally. Publicly. Permanently. And even though nothing about their day-to-day lives would suddenly shift, the sense of completeness that settled over them was undeniable. Back at the house, they celebrated with pancakes, balloons taped haphazardly to the wall, and hand-drawn cards from the boys that said things like, "Best dad ever," and "Thanks for choosing us." Evan read each one like it was a contract more sacred than anything he'd ever signed before. Claire made coffee, then stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching the four of them pile onto the couch in a tangle of limbs and laughter, a living, breathing portrait of everything she never dared to imagine years ago when she held 3 newborns in her arms and wondered how she would ever survive. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to sleep, Evan walked into the bedroom and found Claire holding a small box in her hands. When he opened it, he found a silver ring, simple and unpolished, with the inside engraved with 4 initials, hers, the boys, and his. She didn't say anything, just held it out, and he slipped it onto his finger without question, without needing any promises spoken aloud. He looked at her and said, "I didn't know life could be like this." And she replied, "That's because we hadn't built it yet." They curled into each other, the house quiet around them, the world soft beyond the windows. And in that stillness, in the deep fullness of what they had created together, Evan realized that this messy, loud, perfectly imperfect life, was the only thing he had ever truly wanted. He hadn't found it in wealth or power or silence. He had found it in chalk drawings, mismatched socks, whispered bedtime stories, and a woman who had once been his past, and had now become his forever. What makes the ending of this story so emotionally satisfying to me is how quietly powerful it is. There's no dramatic cliffhanger, no over-the-top declarations, just the slow and steady culmination of choices, small, intentional, deeply human choices. Evan doesn't become a father because he has to or because it's the right thing on paper. He becomes one because his heart genuinely shifts. And that shift, for a man so used to controlling everything, is massive. Claire, on the other hand, learns to let someone in after years of carrying everything on her own. She doesn't surrender her strength, she expands it by allowing trust to grow again. The beauty of their reunion isn't in rewriting the past, but in writing a new future on their own terms. And the boys? They don't fully grasp the weight of what happened in the courtroom, but they feel it. They feel chosen. And that feeling, that they're worth showing up for, worth staying for, is the very heart of the story. This isn't a fairy tale ending. It's better. It's earned, grounded, and real. It reminds us that family isn't always built by blood or by plan, but by presence, love, and the willingness to stay when it's hard. James Henley had built his life around precision. Every move was calculated, every decision deliberate, every risk carefully measured. He had worked relentlessly to turn his name into something powerful, something untouchable. Nothing in his world happened by accident, until the night an 18-year-old girl walked into his restaurant, looked him straight in the eye, and said 6 words that shattered everything he thought he knew. "I think you're my father." For the first time in years, James had no plan, no strategy, no way to predict what came next. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. James Henley never enjoyed dining alone, but tonight was an exception. The restaurant was one of his finest establishments, an elegant and exclusive place known for its flawless service and refined menu. He rarely had time to sit down and enjoy a meal in his own restaurants, but tonight he allowed himself that luxury. It was a quiet evening, and for once, he wasn't surrounded by business associates, investors, or the endless cycle of obligations that came with being the CEO of a multimillion-dollar hospitality empire. He sat at his usual table near the back, where he had the perfect view of the dining floor. The restaurant was running smoothly, as it always did. The waitstaff moved with precision, the guests were content, and the kitchen operated like a well-oiled machine. It was exactly as he expected, perfection. Just as he was about to take a sip of his wine, he felt an odd sensation. Someone was watching him. He glanced up subtly, scanning the room, and his eyes landed on a young woman sitting alone at a table near the far end of the restaurant. She couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, with long brown hair and a posture that suggested both nervousness and determination. At first, he thought she was simply staring absent-mindedly, lost in thought. But the longer he observed her, the clearer it became, her gaze was fixed on him. James wasn't a stranger to being noticed. People often recognized him as a powerful businessman, and sometimes strangers approached him with investment proposals, job requests, or even personal stories of how his restaurants had played a role in their lives. But this felt different. There was something in the way she looked at him, something that sent an unfamiliar unease through him. Before he could analyze it further, she stood up. With careful steps, she made her way toward his table. James set his glass down and straightened slightly, preparing for whatever conversation was about to take place. When she reached his table, she hesitated for just a moment before speaking. "Are you James Henley?" Her voice was steady, though he could detect the slight waver beneath the surface. James studied her for a moment before nodding. "Yes, I am. Can I help you with something?" The young woman took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. "My name is Schuyler Brooks," she said, her voice quieter now. "And I think you're my father." Silence pressed down around them. For the first time in years, James found himself at a complete loss for words. James Henley sat frozen, his mind struggling to process the words that had just been spoken. The sounds of the restaurant faded into a distant hum as he locked eyes with the young woman standing in front of him. "My father." The words echoed in his head, but they felt foreign, misplaced, as if they didn't belong in his world. He had faced difficult negotiations, high-stakes business deals, and cutthroat competition in the corporate world, but nothing had ever caught him so off guard. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to maintain his composure. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice measured but firm. "I think you must be mistaken." Schuyler didn't flinch. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting that response. Her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag, but her gaze remained steady. "I'm not mistaken," she said, her voice quieter now but no less certain. "I know this is a shock, but I wouldn't be here if I wasn't sure." James studied her carefully. There was something unnervingly familiar about her, though he couldn't immediately place it. Her features held a vague resemblance to someone, but his mind was too clouded to connect the dots. He exhaled slowly, deciding to approach this rationally. "Who is your mother?" "Emily Brooks," Schuyler answered without hesitation. The name hit him like a sudden gust of wind. Emily. A memory stirred, one that he had long buried beneath years of relentless ambition. He had known an Emily Brooks once, nearly 2 decades ago, back when he was just a young man trying to build something from nothing. She had been a waitress at a small diner near his first struggling restaurant. They had spent time together, but it had never been serious. At least, that's what he had thought. James leaned back slightly, his fingers pressing together as he tried to mask his growing unease. "I remember her," he admitted, his voice unreadable. "But if what you're saying is true, why didn't she ever tell me?" Schuyler's expression tightened. "Because she didn't want to disrupt your life. She always said you had too much ahead of you, that you were meant for bigger things. She didn't want to hold you back, so she made the decision on her own." James felt something clench in his chest, a mix of frustration and something dangerously close to guilt. The idea that someone had taken such a monumental choice away from him, without even giving him the opportunity to know, left a bitter taste in his mouth. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. "And why are you telling me this now?" Schuyler exhaled, shifting slightly where she stood. "Because she's gone. She passed away 3 months ago." Something in her voice changed as she said it. It was the first real crack in her composure, the first glimpse of vulnerability beneath the determination. James inhaled sharply, but he didn't respond right away. He could see the weight of grief in her posture, in the way she held herself so carefully, as if she had spent months keeping herself together through sheer willpower. He had lost people before, had seen the way grief hollowed out those left behind. He knew that kind of pain. Still, he couldn't ignore the turmoil brewing inside him. This wasn't just about Skylar, it was about the years that had been taken from him. It was about a life he never even knew existed. "What do you expect from me?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now, lacking the cold detachment he had tried to maintain. Skylar looked at him, and for the first time, she hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not here for money or anything like that. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering. I wanted to know you. To know where I come from." James ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling through his nose. He still wasn't sure what to make of this, wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel. But one thing was certain, this conversation wasn't over. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "If we're going to have this conversation, I need to hear everything." Skylar hesitated for only a second before nodding. As she took the seat in front of him, James realized that, for the first time in his life, he was facing a situation where he couldn't negotiate, couldn't strategize his way out. For once, he wasn't in control. And he wasn't sure how to handle it. James sat across from Skylar, trying to steady his thoughts as he watched her settle into the chair. He had faced impossible business negotiations, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes investments that could make or break entire industries, yet none of those moments had ever shaken him the way this did. The weight of her words still lingered, pressing down on him in ways he couldn't fully process. If she was telling the truth, if Emily had really kept this from him for 18 years, then he had been living a life built on an illusion of completeness, never realizing that a missing piece had been out there all along. Skylar exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table as if steadying herself. She looked like she had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, but now that she was here, sitting across from the man she claimed was her father, the reality of it seemed to hit her just as hard as it was hitting him. "I know this is a lot," she said, her voice softer than before. "And I don't expect you to just accept it immediately. I wouldn't either." James studied her carefully. There was something familiar in the way she held herself, the quiet determination in her eyes, the way she refused to shrink under pressure. He had seen that same resilience in himself. "I need the truth," he said, his tone measured. "Everything. No half-truths, no assumptions. Just facts." Skylar nodded, as if she had been prepared for that. "My mom met you when she was 21. She worked at a diner near your first restaurant. She told me you were struggling back then, but you had this drive. She said she knew you were going to be someone important one day." James leaned back slightly, the memory surfacing like a long-forgotten echo. He had been 24 at the time, working 15-hour days to keep his first restaurant from collapsing. He had spent more nights than he could count at that diner, nursing a cheap cup of coffee and scribbling business ideas into a worn notebook. Emily had been one of the waitresses. She had always been kind, always quick with a sharp remark when he looked too stressed. He had liked her, but he had been so consumed by his work that he hadn't thought much beyond that. "We were together for a few months," Skylar continued, watching his face for a reaction. "She never made it seem like it was anything serious, but she also never regretted it. She said she found out she was pregnant after you had already moved on to bigger things. She told me you were opening your second restaurant, that you were finally seeing the success you had worked for." James frowned, a sense of unease creeping in. "And she decided not to tell me?" Skylar hesitated before answering. "She said she thought she was doing the right thing. She told me that back then, you were so focused, so determined to make something of yourself, and she didn't want to be the reason you got sidetracked. She thought she was protecting you from a responsibility you weren't ready for." James clenched his jaw, a mixture of frustration and disbelief swirling inside him. He had spent years believing he had sacrificed everything for success, that his devotion to his work had been a conscious choice. But now he was learning that a choice had been taken from him before he even had the chance to make it. "So she decided for me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Skylar sighed. She didn't hate you. She wasn't angry at you. She just believed she was doing what was best. James rubbed a hand over his face, trying to make sense of it all. 18 years. That was nearly 2 decades of missed birthdays, missed moments, missed everything. He wasn't sure how to feel, angry at Emily for making that decision, frustrated at himself for never questioning what he had left behind, or overwhelmed by the simple fact that sitting across from him was someone who shared his blood. After a long pause, he looked at Skylar again. Why now? Why come find me after all these years? Skylar shifted slightly, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. Because she's gone. And when she died, I realized I didn't have anyone left. I spent my whole life hearing stories about you, knowing who you were but never knowing you, and I got tired of wondering. I just wanted to see for myself. James exhaled, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. He had never been one to dwell on the past. He believed in moving forward, in building something better than what had been left behind. But now, the past had come knocking on his door, and it wasn't something he could ignore. You didn't expect anything from this, did you? He asked after a moment. Skylar shook her head. No. I wasn't even sure if you'd want to see me at all. James studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. I don't know what to do with this, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. I don't know how to process it, and I definitely don't know what it means for either of us. Skylar nodded slowly, as if she had already accepted that answer before she even arrived. I get it, she said. I didn't come here expecting a perfect ending. I just needed to know that I tried. James felt something tighten in his chest at those words. He had spent so much of his life ensuring that he never had regrets, that he never looked back and wondered what could have been. Yet now, sitting across from his own daughter, he realized that no matter how much he had built, there was something missing. And maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to change that. Then let's not leave it at that, he said, his voice steadier this time. If you're willing to give this a chance, I am too. Skylar blinked, surprised by his response, but then a small, almost relieved smile crossed her face. Okay, she said softly. We can start there. James nodded, still unsure of what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't planning 5 steps ahead. He was simply sitting in the moment, knowing that whatever happened next, neither of them had to figure it out alone. James had never been the type to dwell on the past, yet for the first time in years, he found himself struggling to focus on the present. After Skylar had left the restaurant that night, he had sat there for a long time, staring at his untouched meal, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had spent years building his empire, refining his life into a perfectly structured routine, one where surprises were rare and easily managed. But this was something he had never prepared for. For the next few days, his mind kept drifting back to their conversation. Skylar wasn't asking for anything, and somehow, that made it harder to process. If she had wanted money, a name, some kind of inheritance, he would have known how to handle it. But she hadn't come for any of that. She had come for the truth, and now that she had it, James realized he wasn't sure what to do with it. By the time Friday rolled around, he found himself making a decision before he could overthink it. He pulled out his phone, hesitated for only a moment, then dialed the number she had given him. The call rang twice before she picked up. Hello. Skylar's voice was cautious, as if she wasn't sure whether she should be expecting this call. It's James, he said, keeping his tone even. I was wondering if you'd be willing to meet again. There was a brief silence on the other end before she responded. You mean, like a second conversation? Something like that, he admitted. I don't think one dinner is enough for either of us to figure this out. Another pause. Then, her voice softened. Yeah. I'd like that. They agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, somewhere neutral, away from the distractions of his business. James arrived early, as he always did, but this time he wasn't reviewing emails or making calls. He was simply sitting there, trying to decide what he was supposed to say to his own daughter. When Skylar walked in, she spotted him almost immediately. There was something about the way she carried herself that reminded him of Emily, the same quiet confidence, the same way she seemed to assess a room before fully stepping into it. She slid into the seat across from him and gave him a small, cautious smile. "I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you," she admitted, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup the waiter had just placed in front of her. James exhaled. "I wasn't sure either." Skylar let out a quiet chuckle. "Honest. I respect that." James studied her, still adjusting to the idea that she was real, that she wasn't just some distant past coming back to haunt him but a person sitting in front of him, waiting to be acknowledged. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know what's expected of me here." Skylar took a sip of her coffee before setting it down. "I don't think there's a rulebook for something like this. I didn't come here with expectations. I just—" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess I just wanted to see if you wanted to try." James nodded, feeling something loosen inside him at her words. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not the things I already know, but the things I should." Skylar's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if surprised by the request, but then she leaned back in her chair, considering. "Well, I'm a journalism major. I love writing, storytelling, anything that helps me make sense of the world. I grew up in Chicago, mostly just me and my mom. She worked a lot, so I learned how to be independent early on. I like old movies, but only the ones with endings that actually make sense, and I can make a pretty solid cup of coffee, though I guess you'd expect that from someone who worked in cafes half her life." James found himself smirking slightly. "You sound like your mother." Skylar tilted her head. "You say that like it's a bad thing." "It's not," James admitted. "Emily was unforgettable." Skylar's expression softened. "Yeah. She was." A silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time since she had walked into his restaurant, James felt like he wasn't just staring at a stranger. He was looking at someone who had already lived an entire life without him, someone who had grown up with a version of him that he had never known existed. "I want to get to know you," James said finally, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. "I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know how to do this, but I don't want this to be the last time we talk." Skylar studied him carefully, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, slowly, she smiled. "Okay," she said simply. "We can start there." James nodded, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of something shifting in his life. For years, he had believed that his greatest achievements were the ones he had built with his own hands, the ones that had made his name worth something in the world of business. But now, sitting across from Skylar, he realized that maybe the most important thing he would ever build had nothing to do with restaurants, wealth, or success. Maybe, for the first time, it had everything to do with family. James had never been one to second-guess himself. Every decision he made, whether in business or in life, had always been calculated, purposeful, and designed to push him toward success. But this was different. There was no strategy, no clear objective, no defined end goal. For the first time in years, he was stepping into unknown territory, and it unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. The meeting at the cafe with Skylar had gone better than he had expected, but it had also left him with more questions than answers. She was intelligent, confident, and independent, qualities he recognized in himself. Yet, she had grown up without him, had built an entire life without knowing anything about the man sitting across from her. James wasn't sure what kind of father he could be to her now, after all these years, but he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away from this. A few days later, he texted her. "Are you free this weekend?" Skylar's response came quickly. "Depends." Are you trying to test my patience with another serious conversation? James smirked as he read the message, shaking his head before replying. No serious conversations. Just dinner. No expectations, ***. After a moment, her answer appeared. All right. But I get to pick the place, ***. James let out a quiet chuckle, already realizing she wasn't the type to simply follow his lead. Deal. That Saturday evening, James found himself waiting outside a small, cozy restaurant in a part of the city he rarely visited. It wasn't the kind of place he would have chosen, no exclusivity, no high-end clientele, no Michelin stars. But when Skylar arrived, looking far more at ease than she had during their previous meetings, he realized that maybe that was the point. Glad to see you're branching out, she teased as she walked up to him. James smirked. I like to keep an open mind. She raised an eyebrow. Do you? I'm working on it, he admitted. Inside, the restaurant was warm and inviting, with wooden tables, dim lighting, and the comforting hum of quiet conversations. It wasn't the kind of place where deals were made or fortunes were discussed. It was a place where people came to simply enjoy good food, and James found himself appreciating that more than he expected. Skylar scanned the menu with an ease that told him she had probably been here before. I figured this was safer than taking you to a fast food place, she joked. James leaned back slightly. You think I couldn't handle that? Skylar smirked. Oh, I know you couldn't handle that. Their food arrived, and as they ate, the conversation flowed more naturally than before. Skylar told him about her college classes, the challenges of balancing coursework with her part-time job, and the stories she dreamed of writing one day. James listened, genuinely interested, realizing how much of her life he had missed. At one point, she glanced up at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. So, what about you? What's the part of your life that people don't read about in business magazines? James exhaled, considering the question. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him something like that. People always wanted to know about his strategies, his deals, his next big move. But Skylar wasn't interested in the businessman, she wanted to know the person. I used to want to be a chef, he admitted. Skylar's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Seriously? James nodded. Before I got into restaurant ownership, I spent years working in kitchens. I loved the process, the creativity of it. But I realized pretty quickly that I was better at running things than I was at following someone else's recipes. Skylar tilted her head. Do you still cook? Not as much as I should, James said, a small smirk playing at his lips. But I could probably still impress you. Skylar laughed. All right, now I have to see this. Next time, you're cooking. James raised an eyebrow. Are you saying there's going to be a next time? Skylar pretended to think about it before shrugging. We'll see how dinner goes first. By the time they finished their meal, James realized something unexpected, he had actually enjoyed himself. There were no business discussions, no strategic conversations, just two people getting to know each other. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to control the outcome. As they stepped outside, Skylar pulled her jacket tighter around herself, glancing up at him. This was nice, she admitted. James nodded. It was. Skylar hesitated for a second, then looked at him with something almost hesitant in her expression. You don't have to force this, you know. If it's too much, if you don't know what to do with it. I get it. James met her gaze, understanding what she was really saying. She was giving him an out, an escape from the uncertainty of trying to build something neither of them had expected. But as he looked at her, standing there with a quiet kind of strength that reminded him so much of himself, he knew he wasn't going anywhere. I don't walk away from things that matter, he said simply. Skylar searched his face for a moment before nodding. Okay, she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Then I guess we'll see where this goes. James watched as she walked toward her car, feeling something shift inside him. For years, his life had been about building an empire, about ensuring that nothing and no one could disrupt the world he had created for himself. But now, for the first time, he wasn't thinking about profits or expansion. He was thinking about her. And that, more than anything, made him realize that this was only the beginning. James had always been good at keeping his personal and professional lives separate. Over the years, he had perfected the balance, business came first, and everything else fell into place behind it. But ever since Skylar walked into his life, that balance had started to shift. He found himself thinking about her in moments he normally reserved for strategy meetings or investment plans. It wasn't something he had expected, and it wasn't something he knew how to handle. After their dinner, he hadn't reached out for a few days. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure what the next step was supposed to be. There was no guidebook for this, no blueprint for how to suddenly become a father to an 18-year-old. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that waiting for the perfect moment wasn't going to change anything. He had built an empire by taking risks, by making choices even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. This was no different. So, on Wednesday afternoon, he picked up his phone and sent her a message. "Dinner at my place this Friday? I owe you proof that I can cook, ****. Skylar's response came minutes later. "This I have to see. Are we talking actual cooking or just heating up takeout and calling it homemade, ****? James smirked as he typed back. "You underestimate me. I'm prepared to be surprised." By the time Friday evening rolled around, James found himself standing in his kitchen, sleeves rolled up, carefully arranging ingredients on the counter. He had thought about hiring a private chef to ensure everything was perfect, but something about that felt like cheating. If Skylar was going to believe he had actual culinary skills, he had to prove it himself. When the doorbell rang, he wiped his hands on a towel and made his way to the door. Skylar stood there, arms crossed, her expression laced with amusement. "You're really going through with this," she said, stepping inside. James smirked. "I don't make empty promises." She glanced around, taking in the sleek, modern space. "I have to admit, I expected something a little colder. This actually feels lived in." James chuckled. "I do live here." Skylar raised an eyebrow. "Do you, though? Or is this just the place you sleep when you're not running your empire?" He considered that for a moment before shrugging. "Maybe a little of both." She followed him into the kitchen, watching as he moved with practiced ease, chopping vegetables, seasoning meat, heating up a pan. "Okay, I'll admit it. You look like you actually know what you're doing," she said, leaning against the counter. James glanced at her. "I told you, I used to want to be a chef." Skylar tilted her head. "What made you change your mind?" He exhaled, stirring the sauce before answering. "I realized I wanted control over more than just the kitchen. I wanted to build something bigger, something that would last. Owning restaurants gave me that." Skylar watched him for a moment before nodding. "I get that. My mom used to say you were relentless, that once you decided on something, there was no stopping you." James's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before he continued cooking. "She wasn't wrong," he admitted. Skylar picked up a piece of chopped bell pepper from the cutting board and popped it into her mouth. "You know, she never said anything bad about you. She always told me you were ambitious, that you had a vision most people didn't." James turned to look at her fully. "Did you ever resent her for not telling me?" Skylar hesitated, as if considering how honest she wanted to be. "For a while, yeah. When I was younger, I used to wonder what it would have been like to grow up knowing you. But as I got older, I started to understand why she made the choice she did. She thought she was doing what was best, even if I don't agree with it." James nodded slowly. "I would have wanted to know." Skylar gave him a small smile. Yeah. I figured that out when you didn't walk away. For the first time since meeting her, James felt a sense of clarity about the situation. He couldn't change the past, couldn't rewrite the years they had lost. But he could choose what happened next. They sat down to eat, and to his satisfaction, Skylar didn't hold back on her approval. Okay, I'll admit it, she said after taking a bite. You actually can cook. James smirked. Told you. Skylar pointed her fork at him. This does not mean I'll stop questioning your skills in the future. James chuckled. I wouldn't expect anything less. As the night went on, conversation came easier. They talked about things that weren't heavy, movies, music, travel, little pieces of their lives that had nothing to do with the complications that had brought them together. James realized that for the first time, it wasn't about figuring out what their relationship was supposed to be. It was just about existing in the moment. When Skylar finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. Thanks for dinner, she said. James nodded. Thanks for coming. She looked at him for a moment, as if debating whether to say something else. Then, finally, she took a breath. I think I'd like to keep doing this. Getting to know you. James felt something settle inside him, something that had been unsteady since the moment she walked into his restaurant. I'd like that too, he said. Skylar gave him a small smile before heading toward the elevator. James watched her go, realizing that for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with power or success. For once, he was just looking forward to seeing her again. James had never been someone who did things halfway. Whether it was in business or life, he approached everything with full commitment or not at all. That was how he had built his empire, how he had secured his position as one of the most successful men in the industry. But this, building a relationship with Skylar, was different. There was no strategy, no clear-cut path to success. It was uncertain, unpredictable, and entirely outside his comfort zone. Yet, for the first time, he didn't mind that uncertainty. Over the past few weeks, their meetings had become more frequent. What had started as cautious conversations had slowly evolved into something more natural, something that almost resembled what a father and daughter relationship might be. They didn't force anything, instead, they let things unfold as they would. That Saturday, James found himself driving toward the university campus where Skylar lived. It wasn't an area he had ever needed to visit before, but when she had mentioned in passing that she was working on an article for a journalism class and needed help with research, he had offered without hesitation. When he pulled up outside the small cafe where they had agreed to meet, he spotted her sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in one hand and her laptop open in front of her. She looked up as he walked in, a small, amused smile tugging at her lips. I still can't believe you willingly came to a college cafe, she teased as he took the seat across from her. James smirked. I told you, I'm expanding my horizons. Skylar raised an eyebrow. You say that, but I feel like you're just waiting for an excuse to leave. James chuckled, shaking his head. I'm here, aren't I? She leaned back, studying him for a moment before nodding. Fair enough. He glanced at her screen. So, what exactly am I helping you with? Skylar sighed, running a hand through her hair. I have to write a profile piece on someone successful, but instead of doing the obvious and writing about you, I wanted to take a different approach. I'm focusing on self-made entrepreneurs, people who started with nothing and built something for themselves. I thought you might have some insight. James nodded, leaning back in his chair. So, you want to know what makes someone successful? Skylar tapped her fingers against her coffee cup. More like, what separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't? James considered that for a moment before answering. Resilience. A lot of people have good ideas, but not many have the ability to get back up every time they fail. The ones who succeed are the ones who don't let failure define them. Skylar tilted her head, intrigued. So, you think failure is necessary? James smirked. Absolutely. No one builds something great without falling on their face a few times. The trick is figuring out how to use failure instead of letting it stop you. Skylar nodded, jotting something down. You make it sound like it's just a mindset. It is, James said simply. Most people quit because they convince themselves they've lost before they've actually lost. She watched him for a moment before smirking. You really don't believe in losing, do you? James chuckled. I believe in learning. That's the difference. Skylar shook her head in amusement. I have to admit, you make a compelling argument. They spent the next hour talking, not just about her article, but about business, about life, about the things James had learned over the years. Skylar listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made him think, pushing him in a way that few people ever did. At some point, she set her pen down and looked at him more seriously. Do you ever regret it? James frowned slightly. Regret what? Building all of this at the cost of everything else, she said, gesturing slightly. You've built this empire, but was it worth everything you had to give up? James exhaled, considering the question. He had been asked about success before, about how he had achieved it, but no one had ever asked if he regretted it. For a long time, I thought I didn't, he admitted. But then you walked into my restaurant, and suddenly, I started wondering what I might have missed. Skylar held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. I think she would have wanted you to know, she said softly, referring to her mother. Even if she didn't say it. James nodded, his expression unreadable. Maybe. But I can't change the past. The only thing I can do is figure out what comes next. Skylar smiled slightly. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're doing okay so far. James smirked. High praise, coming from you. She laughed, shaking her head. Don't get used to it. As they finished their coffee, James realized something. This wasn't just about making up for lost time. It was about creating something new, something real. He didn't know what kind of father he was supposed to be, and maybe neither of them knew exactly what their relationship would look like, but they were figuring it out together. And for once, James was okay with not having all the answers. James had spent his entire life chasing success. He had built an empire from the ground up, turning his name into something that carried weight in the business world. He was known as a man who never backed down, who never wasted time on anything that didn't directly contribute to his goals. But sitting across from Skylar in that small cafe, watching her scribble notes with an ease that reminded him of the way he used to map out business plans in his early days, he realized that success suddenly had a different meaning. It wasn't about the number of restaurants he owned or the wealth he had accumulated. It wasn't about the reputation he had spent years perfecting. It was about this, being present in a moment that actually mattered. Over the past few months, their conversations had changed from cautious introductions to something that felt natural, something that felt real. He had expected it to be difficult, expected it to feel like an obligation he wasn't sure how to fulfill. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that this wasn't an obligation at all. It was a choice, one he had made without hesitation. Skylar looked up from her notebook, studying him with the same sharp, assessing gaze he had seen in the mirror so many times. You seem different today, she said, her tone light but curious. James leaned back slightly, sipping his coffee before responding. How so? Skylar tapped her pen against the table. Less like you're trying to figure everything out all at once. More like you're just, here. James smirked. I didn't realize I was that transparent. Skylar shrugged. You have a presence. When you're in a room, people know. You don't just exist, you calculate, you analyze. But right now, you seem settled. James considered that for a moment. Maybe I am. Skylar arched an eyebrow. That doesn't scare you? James chuckled, shaking his head. A little. But not in a bad way. She smiled, seemingly satisfied with that answer, before closing her notebook. You know, when I first walked into that restaurant, I had no idea what I wanted from you. I didn't expect anything. I just needed to see for myself. James nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. And now? Skylar exhaled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Now, I think I just want to keep seeing where this goes. No pressure, no expectations. Just, figuring it out as we go. James smirked. That's a very unhenly approach. Skylar laughed. Maybe, but it's the best I've got. James nodded, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. Then we'll go with that. As they left the cafe and stepped out into the crisp evening air, James felt something unfamiliar but welcome, a sense of possibility that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with deals or expansion. It was just about this, about the connection that had formed between them, about the realization that family wasn't something that had to be perfect to be real. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next move, or the next milestone. He wasn't planning 5 steps ahead or trying to control every outcome. He was just standing there, in the moment, knowing that for once, he didn't need to have all the answers. And that, more than anything, felt like the greatest success he had ever achieved. The ending of this story is powerful because it's not about grand gestures or dramatic resolutions, it's about choice. James Henley starts as a man who believes his life is complete, structured, and entirely in his control. He has built his empire, made his fortune, and shaped his world exactly as he wanted. But Skylar's arrival shatters that illusion, forcing him to confront a truth he never even knew existed, that success means nothing if there's no one to share it with. What makes the conclusion so satisfying is that it doesn't force an unrealistic reconciliation. James doesn't suddenly become the perfect father overnight, nor does Skylar instantly fill the role of the daughter he never had. Instead, they acknowledge that relationships, especially ones built on lost time, aren't about immediate fixes but about effort. Skylar never came looking for financial security or validation, she came for truth, and she got more than she expected. James, on the other hand, started this journey believing he was doing the right thing by simply acknowledging her existence, but by the end, he realizes that what truly matters is the willingness to be present. This story doesn't rely on dramatic conflicts or forced emotional moments. It's grounded in reality, 2 people figuring out what they mean to each other, step by step. James doesn't have all the answers, and Skylar doesn't expect him to. That's what makes their final moment so impactful. It's not about having everything figured out, it's about choosing to keep showing up, to keep learning, to keep trying. Ultimately, the beauty of the ending lies in its simplicity. James doesn't just gain a daughter, he gains perspective, realizing that some of the most important things in life can't be planned, controlled, or negotiated. And Skylar? She walks away with the one thing she was searching for all along, *a beginning star.